Next up is Big Douglas, otherwise known as Big Ben or Ben Big Douglas. Ben got his first taste for bird watching while growing up with a mom and grandfather that loved to watch the birds over a cup of coffee. Many years later, while embroiled in a career in technology, the birding bug would strike hard and bird watching would become his primary hobby. In 2018, Ben visited every state park in Minnesota in just 7 months while hiking and bird watching. To follow that up in 2019, he visited every one of Minnesota's 87 counties 3 times en route to recording over 10,000 county ticks with every county over 100 species, all while holding a full-time job. Ben writes articles for birding newsletters, volunteers on the MOU's social media and awards committees, and helps lead birding trips. Ben has presented and spoken on birding subjects to several organizations, including St. Croix Audubon, Minnesota River Valley Audubon, and the MOU, of course. Ben will be the keynote speaker at this year's Hastings Area Earth Day Birding Festival that's happening at Carpenter Nature Center on April 22nd. Ben is here today to teach us about shorebirds, when, where, and how. Thank you, Ben. Take it away.
Thank you, Jen. That is a wonderful intro. Maybe oversells me a little bit, but I do love birding. So I am going to share, get to the top here and get this and see if this will go. All right, back at the top, can everybody, or at least Jen or somebody, validate that you can see my prezo?
It looks beautiful.
We can see it. Looks
okay,
great.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to start my own timer here because I have a boatload of content and I'm going to have to cut some of it short. I told Jen when we started today that I got through a third of my presentation in my first go through and I was at 30 minutes and I realized I had a problem. There is a lot to talk about with shorebirds. So we're going to talk about where, when, and how. And the how being the identification part is at the end, because I honestly believe that with this group of birds, one of the most important things you need is to where you can even find them and when you can find them. It's really easy as a casual birder to completely miss them or to not realize where they are or what's going on with them. The alternative title for this presentation was So You've Decided to Ruin Your Life. A little bit cheeky, but the honest truth is shorebirds are a challenge. Some of them are super easy based on plumage, and then the rest of them are, okay, I'm going to have to do some work here. And this is a working group, in my opinion. So a lot on here. We're going to talk about some habitat locations and then very specific locations and everything. So one thing I do want to do before I forget, because I did forget to do it, is I've got links and I need to drop these into the chat right now so I do not forget. I'm going to refer to a whole bunch of links, and now those links are in the chat, so you won't have to try and write them down or scrabble them down or anything of that sort or whatever. They'll be in the chat for you. All right, get this back onto screen focus. So when we talk about, and I need to get, having quite a time here. I don't know why the video is in my way, but it is. Minimize that. Okay, now we've got it. Sorry. So I've noted here a bunch of different habitat locations. These are all locations where you will find shorebirds, and some of them can end up being a little bit surprising, but the biggest factor that I want everyone to take away from this particular slide is the reality that you don't find the majority of your shorebirds at the local park. So you just heard Sonia referenced Lake Elmo Park. It is my favorite park. I commented on it in the chat. It's a mile from my house. I find a few shorebirds there, but it's not really good shorebird habitat. It's not flooded farm fields. It's not drawn down water bodies like Lake Billsby down in Dakota County that we'll talk about in a minute. It's not generally drought-stricken ponds with nice mud flats and slicks. It's not the North Ottawa impoundment and things of that sort. It's not a water treatment plant. Quite honestly, it was referenced in my bio. In 2019, I did a big year and touched all of the counties, and I personally visited right around 90 sewage ponds during that year. So you kind of get to know the state, and these are the locations where the shorebirds are at. Move this forward. So one of the things about the where is finding really good quality locations and having some fidelity to those locations, being regulars at a good shorebird spot really pays off the dividends. At the top of the whole thing, Michelle kicked things off and mentioned the Salt Lake Birding Festival. Salt Lake itself is a very good birding location. It's a very good shorebirding location. Additionally, then Lake Bilsby is absolutely phenomenal. The reason why it's phenomenal is very specific. The Cannon River dumps into the west end of the lake. And because of that, let me just pop this up on screen here. You can see the Cannon River right here. And I've actually marked on a Google map. That is one of the links I put in there. There's a Google map. This is the tiny URL, which is just a way to shorten URL so I didn't have to put a billion characters on here. It's in the chat. You'll have access to this map for quite some time. I'll leave it up in my profile for a good long while so individuals can use it. But this river, when it is drawn down in the spring to account for runoff, creates mud flats through this entire river delta area up to maybe this point here, which is a Goodhue boat launch, a public boat launch. And then you could look back in these directions here. The deeper water to the east is really good waterfowl territory. And this is all shorebird territory in these spaces here on it specifically. So just going back to some of these, you heard some of this stuff mentioned already. You'll hear it time and again when you're in the birding community, good shorebird locations. They're all on the map. I recommend people take a look at some of these locations. There's a good combo here with Lake Bilsby and 180th Street Marsh. If you happen to be in the Metro or South Metro, really good couple of spots to go to in the spring. Personally, I went to Lake Bilsby, literally 12 times in a month and a half. And I live in Washington County. It's about 45 minutes. I did it 12 times last year while I was doing a big year because I wanted to make sure that I got as many shorebirds as I possibly could. A little bit further, we talked about water treatment plants or sewage ponds. They're not all created equal. There's different value in different locations, and that's something you kind of get to know over time when you visit these locations. I've included these on the map as well, just these sample ones. You're going to hear from Kim Eckert later. He's going to talk about the book. A lot of this stuff is knowledge and information passed down between generations of birders. That's where I got to know these locations. And then eBird hotspots started popping up. And then I started creating my own maps to help guide me on the places I really enjoy going to. So I highly recommend people get comfortable with my maps on Google, store some of your locations so that you can, kind of get to know locations over time. Another thing that I wanted to really talk about here before we get into any identification type stuff is really experienced shorebirders pick up on seasonal opportunities. We talked a little bit about these annual planned drawdowns, but there's also freshly flooded fields, quite literally. And now this is the challenge of birding sometimes is we want to go places that other people are generally trying to avoid. And that is true during flood scenarios or at least heavy rain scenarios. Out in the western part of the state where all the ag fields are, the more rain they've gotten, that is bad for crops in most situations. But the reality is if they can't plant a field, if they can't be tilling it, and there's standing water in low areas, that's shorebird city. And that is a temporary thing. They're drain tiling a lot of fields. So you have to get out there a couple of days after it rains and look for shorebirds during the right times of the year. Impoundments were brought up. North Auto impoundment is a really great example of one. There are other impoundments out there. But basically, annually, you find these opportunities on social media. I know some people aren't on Facebook. That is one of the biggest vectors that I've found to find new or temporary locations within the state where shorebirds are really starting to show up. Because again, finding more shorebirds is going to places where they are, and they're generally not coming to our local parks in the city. They are generally out in the farm fields, out in flood zones or drawdown locations, or even fresh cut hay and alfalfa fields. So especially in the fall, when a field gets fresh cut, if it's getting close to migration time, the killdeer are going to set up shop there. And then that's when the buff-breasted sandpipers come in. That's when other individuals are coming in that are a little more dry habitat type birds and everything like upland sandpiper as well. I have a few examples, but I'm just gonna give this one in here. This particular location out in Yellow Medicine County, Curtis Lake, was brought to the birding world's attention in March, I believe it was, of 2021. And this is a location that a cinnamon teal showed up for a little bit. And we were notified, I believe it was by Garrett Wee. He was a previous field trip coordinator for MOU. And he said, hey, everybody, pay attention. It's going to be a good year at Curtis Lake. They're doing some drawdown stuff and we're in a drought and the water levels are low. And that's putting everybody on notice. It was a very good spring. I didn't make it there in the spring, but I had birds I wanted to get in the fall. When August came around, I took a look at recent eBird reports and it looked really good. I turned this kind of sideways, so north is to the right. When I showed up with a friend of mine, every ounce of water on the south side of the road was gone. This was literally nothing more than a field of weeds. But there's still some water inflow on these other ponds here. I'd say the western ponds, but they look like they're at the north end of this, the way I've tilted the map. We got 14 species of shorebirds here in August, including buff-breasted sandpiper being a really good target bird for me personally on it. And it all came down to knowing what was going on. You don't just find a location like this on accident, all but, a few times. It was paying attention to social media that got it for me, or doing a little bit of research on eBird to find out where shorebirds were being found. I had other examples in here. I'm just going to shift past these a little bit and jump into route building. So I kind of want to help everybody get a little bit of a toolbox as far as, okay, you're telling me where stuff is, but what am I supposed to do? Just like go drive to a location? The thing that has worked best for me, and I know works really well for other individuals, is to create a loop, to literally create a Google Maps birding loop. And I'll just show one here on screen. I live in the East Metro in Washington County, here on the right-hand side of the screen, if you can see it. I have to drive all the way across the Metro, both exiting and returning. So this is like 2 hours of driving right here just to get in and out of the Metro. But the rest of this is just out in country roads. And so some of those hot spots I gave you, I just plugged a few in and said, well, what if I said, I'm going to be ready for a bathroom break in Dassel, so I'm going to stop at the water treatment plant there just on the edge of town. I then want to make sure I go to Bird Island. It was on this previous slide right back here because it's a very good location with a cemetery and sewage ponds. And then there's some low-lying spots that produce birds as well in flood years. So tagging these things together in series and creating a loop, the most important thing I could possibly convey to you is bird in between. Just use them as an excuse to go for a ride, and then bird in between. Take the side roads, look for low-lying areas, look for standing water. That's where the shorebirds are. These aren't warblers. It's not, I'll just go to the woods that I've always known and there will be warblers there during migration. That'll probably always be true. Shorebirds are a little more finicky like that, and they want to be out in the farm fields. They want to be out in the open with mud flats, and you basically just have to kind of war drive a little bit to go find them. And I just use existing hotspots as the excuse to create that route and say, well, how much time do I have available to me? How am I going to get there? So talk about timing a little bit. I don't have to go too deep into this because it's already been brought up. And the link has been in chat a couple of times. Lulu.com is the printing service for the MOU day planner. I highly recommend a day planner. It has things like this at the back of it, not just day planning stuff. And it will give you this, oh yeah, that's right. Shorebirds in the southern part of the state in the spring are mid-April to mid-May. But in the north, they're late April to late May. So that means I can shorebird effectively from mid or early April even, probably not this early April, into late May. And then sometimes you'll get some shorebirds that'll linger pretty late up in Duluth and things of that sort or whatever. But there's resources like that inside that day planner. And it can be really good to just kind of have that with you. Additionally, MOU does have some really good resources that are available. And I believe a lot of people can get to these even if you're not members, but I would encourage you to consider membership. So out on the MOU website here, there is review reported birds on the left-hand side. When you open that up, there are several links right here that have migration as the first word. When you click on these, you get various iterations of this. Little off-putting at first, but these are incredibly valuable. Here's stilt sandpiper, and the red is typically the southern part of the state, and the blue is the northern part of the state. And we can see an extreme peak in this species right around the second week of May into the third week of May. So that's your window of opportunity for stilt sandpiper. And then we get the same thing in the fall. We can see the peak when it starts, when it ends. It's a little bit wider because birds aren't as in big of a hurry, and there's a lot more nuanced things going on in migration. I bring this stuff up because there's really good resources to educate ourselves and to say, okay, I need more information. I need to understand what's going on here before I go out and just start shorebirding. One other one I want to mention, instead of being in the previous location noted, birding in Minnesota, there is a detailed occurrence information, and these are the detailed species pages. So you can see here, we have a very similar chart, but we have a boatload of other information, such as, are they common or uncommon in particular counties and areas? How are they kind of listing around the state? And breeding range, if it exists for a bird. A lot of our shorebirds don't breed in the state. And then more specific dates and historic kind of details and stuff. I love these pages. It's a really good work that went into putting these together, and highly recommend people take a look at them, because it's kind of like having a field guide online, readily available, customized to Minnesota. All I want to note from this slide here is that if you miss some birds, it's not all completely over. There is shorebirding to be done in the summer, and never fear, the turnaround is very quick for these birds, as you'll see in a minute. We do have state breeders like American woodcock, Wilson snipe, spotted sandpiper. These are the ever-present members of docks on small lakes and stuff. Killdeer, which a lot of us are familiar with, but there are several other birds that can, occasionally or rarely nest in the state. And as you get up to the Northwest, you heard, in the previous presentation about going up to some of these prairie spaces. These are your great opportunities to pick up upland sandpiper and marbled godwit on breeding territory. As well as Wilson's phalarope and a lot of the small sloughs and, marshes and things of that sort. In there. If you want more information, one of the links I provided in the chat is to the Minnesota Breeding Bird Atlas, as well as going to eBird and filtering for reports between June and July, or just trimming it up however you like in there. So one more plug for the day planner. Shorebirds do not mess around. They are the fastest breeding turnover bird that we have in this state. So all of these birds that exit north, they start turning around by mid to late June, even for some of the species, failed nests, early nesters, whatever. Their turnaround is like 4 to 6 weeks. They do not mess around. The adults, when they verify the children are good to go and they can feed themselves, they literally just leave. There's no more parenting to be done. If you look at this chart, this is clipped also from the day planner. 19 of the 20 first returning birds in the fall are literally all shorebirds. As a group, they come back faster than anything. So when we get through the doldrums, or what is commonly known as the doldrums in Minnesota, by late June, it's already time to start shorebirding again. These were already talked about as well, so I'm just going to glaze over this stuff. The only other thing I want to note, the Hastings Earth Day Bird Festival that I am keynoting coming up in April, one of the day trips for that is down to Lake Bilsby with Jerry Hoekstra. He's the editor of our MOU newsletter, an accomplished photographer, and a very good birder. He will be down there for an extended trip with this festival that you can sign up for. So if you're interested in kind of getting up to speed, this is a great opportunity to do so. You will experience all the different hotspots of Lake Bilsby on that trip. And I'm just going to pop through this stuff. Okay. So we're in the house space, and good. I'm leaving enough space for it. So I blazed through a bunch of stuff there, getting us into the how. There is a truth and a reality, and you heard it from Sonia first. A scope changes the game, and it is a bummer, but it is the truth. I have a scope. I'm fortunate to have one, and 50% of the work that it does is get me shorebirds. Obviously, I do it for other things as well. I use it for waterfowl. It works really well for that, and raptors. But a lot of these birds are just gettable with binoculars if you've got a decent pair. Shorebirds, there's a percentage of the shorebirds. The challenge is that the smallest one, a least sandpiper, is the size of a song sparrow. Trying to identify a song sparrow from 100 yards away is not easy if you don't hear it singing. And that's the challenge sometimes with some of these shorebirds. So it's the nature of the beast. It is something to consider what level of frustration you might have or not have, depending on your equipment. Cameras were brought up also in the first presentation. Bridge cameras and super zoom cameras have literally changed the game. It's like having a scope in your hand at sometimes a fraction of the price. It just depends on what market you're in for. You heard about the camera that Isabella was utilizing. My particular camera is the Nikon Coolpix P1000. I've enjoyed this camera series for a while. The 950 is a smaller model, but they boast 80 plus X zoom. And in fact, on the Coolpix P1000, it has a 3200 millimeter equivalent lens, fixed lens to it. So it is literally like having a 70x scope or 80 plus X scope in your hand. The only challenge ends up being how steady you can keep it. So maybe it's a monopod or whatever, but these can help change the game a lot. Equipment does matter in shorebirds. You can still get shorebirds and get a good percentage of them without them, but it is something I did not want to ignore because it just is the reality. Study is a thing. I've got links. The links are in the chat. I recommend people take a look at links and read up in advance. There are nuances inside of the shorebird group that you really want to know about before you get in the field. But when you get in the field, what you need to be paying attention to. So obviously I've been speaking very quickly. I think I got myself to a point in the presentation I can slow down a little bit because I actually literally say it on the slide, slow down. Shorebirds require patience. And they require an observation that we don't often use. So a lot of times if we're watching warblers, we're just looking for color. We're looking for, okay, well, where's the color on that? Does it have a wing bar? Does it have this? Does it have that? And then you make the identification. And in some cases, like, oh, that's a Blackburnian warbler, cool. And then you watch it and it goes about its business and you feel better about life. Shorebirds are a little bit different sometimes. Things matter. I have some silhouettes in the background. I pulled these off of All About Birds. Which is a link that I've provided, and it's from eBird or from Cornell Lab of Ornithology. The bird on the left is a prototypical sandpiper, so like a least sandpiper, and the bird on the right is a prototypical plover. Now, a lot of times we just look at these and be like, okay, yeah, and what? So the bird on the right as a plover is upright. It is standing upright. It is the type of bird that has a larger eye and it will go run after something and eat it and then stand there and look around and then do that again. The bird on the left as a sandpiper is more typically crouched. So you can see the bend in the legs. It's bent down, it's crouched, and it's picking things off the surface. It's literally looking directly in front of its head and feeding and picking things from the surface or maybe subsurface. And then some of them have those really long bills, as we've seen from like Wilson snipe and things of that sort, and they're probing into mud. But the important thing is the posture. You can see this bird is almost horizontal in its body, but this bird over here on the right is upright. It has this kind of, angle to it. The legs are straight. It runs on those legs. These guys here, when they're feeding, they are crouched down, bent over, looking at the ground. Those things matter. So when we talk about the shorebirds, we have to talk about every characteristic and every variable that we possibly can in these groups. I mentioned it earlier, size matters as well. I mentioned about least sandpipers about the size of a song sparrow. Getting comfortable with size differences relative to one another and a bird you do know can be the difference between getting to an ID and missing the ID. So if you know killdeer, if you say, okay, well, I know that bird. It's loud, kind of obnoxious, and has a double dark ring on its breast and neck. Well, it's 10.5 inches in size, and that makes it about an American robin. And you can break down the entire group from that point. Smaller than a killdeer, Okay, it's going to be one of these sandpipers, or whatever, and least is the very smallest one. So if you can get to an ID on some of these birds, you can use relative sizing when they're near each other as a metric to be like, okay, well, if it's bigger than a killdeer, then I can totally rule out like 6 or 7 other birds and start getting to an ID. So again, size matters. And I put this slide together specifically for that purpose. Everything matters. The bill length, the bill shape. Is it needle-like? Is it blunted at the tip? Is it very long? Does it decurve, upcurve? Any of that stuff matters. Noting it in the field, writing it down if you have to, all that stuff matters. Does it appear to have a long neck? No neck? Is it just like a head attached to a body effectively? There are other things like leg length and color, but we have to be wary of some of this stuff as well. There's pitfalls everywhere in the shorebird group. If I tell you a least sandpiper has yellow legs and you go in the field and look at a bird and you're like, it look like dark legs to me, so it's not a least, be careful. You have the tendency to put mud all over your legs when that's when you walk in all day. So there are situations where a bird's leg color is not going to be helpful to you, or it's not going to be a definitive factor. All of these identifications are a group of things put together. Wing length is even a thing in a couple of the birds, and we will see that in a few photos as long as I can keep pushing through this. So really just take as many characteristics as you can, as many as you've learned, and use them all to make the identification. What is the bird doing when you're watching it becomes as important as many of the other characteristics. All right, and we kind of talked about these habits do matter, that, kind of feeding methods. Is it upright and running around? Is it crouched over and probing? Is it like literally like a sewing machine with a long bill probing deep into the mud? That narrows you down very quickly to just a handful of birds. Is it running around in circles, comically spinning to like stir the pot? That ends up being a phalarope species. So it can help put you in spaces really quickly. Does it have long legs and it's wading a little bit deeper in the water, further out than the other birds? That helps say, okay, well, longer legged birds, that's going to rule out a whole bunch over here. And if you're up at like in Duluth at Park Point, is it a surf bird? Is it running out with the waves and back in? Is it, following the water in and out? Only a handful of birds do those specific things and operate that way. Okay. I mentioned some of this. I'm not going to hang on this. There are some birds that can be relatively easy when they're in breeding plumage. And that kind of becomes a thing, is to understand there's breeding plumage and then there's non-breeding plumage, alternate and basic, all these different things going on. In the spring, it's a really good opportunity to get your first touch with some of the birds. Say, okay, now that we're in breeding plumage on some of these, let's see if I can lock a few of them down. And some of them have very specific habits. A spotted sandpiper dances around like a water thrush. If you know northern and Louisiana water thrush, spotted sandpiper is the water thrush of the shorebirds. It has, a pretty distinctive body as well, but has a tendency to bounce around quite a bit while it's standing around, and it does it constantly. So it's a little bit easier to pick out. So let's take a look at a few things and run through these on there. So, when I talk about obvious things, double rings on a killdeer, if the bird has 2 rings on its chest, it is a killdeer. There is no other bird in Minnesota that I'm aware of anyway that looks like this, that has 2 rings on its chest and a nice red orbital eye ring. Just straight away, a really good keystone bird to be like, okay, it's in the plover group, it's standing upright, kind of loud and obnoxious, but there's the 2 rings. And then we can go into some other birds. So these birds were photographed in Duluth on the beach, and I happened to get 2 ruddy turnstones flanking or bodyguarding a dunlin. So when it comes to things that are obvious, these ruddy turnstones really stand out. They have a very unique facial pattern in full breeding plumage. They've got this nice dark U shape that comes off of each side of the neck. They have this nice kind of black and white stark pattern through the eye. on it, and nothing else looks like them. They're really big, kind of, chunky at 9.5 inches. And then they've got this nice ruddy back over black on it. And then this Dunlin, in full breeding plumage anyway, has this really nice dark belly patch. And when a whole flock of them gets up and flies chaotically back and forth, when they show you that belly, you can see it in flight as well. You can see that nice black belly on them. And then this bill, you can see this bill decurving on it. So picking up these characteristics and getting to know them, you're like, okay, I can start to eliminate some of these birds and say a group that's, say, 37 types, 37 species strong in Minnesota, including all of the casuals and accidentals, I can break down 10 or 15 of them. So at least you've got that to go for it. This is kind of humorous. I included this is from Big Bog SRA back in 2019, I think it was. And this is the most atypical spot I've ever found a Wilson snipe, because usually they're out in the mud. And this one was literally in the middle of the woods at the entrance road, probably looking for a nest site. But these birds have these really nice golden streaks down the back. And I have found nothing else in the shorebird group to look like this. If I can see the golden streaks, even at a very long distance with poor lighting, I can just say, okay, got it. That long-billed bird is a Wilson snipe. It's not one of the dowitchers or anything of that sort. So picking a few things out like that can really help you, kind of eliminate that stuff. Here's our spotted sandpiper, nice orange bill on it, white underbelly, black spots, and it's going to be waving its butt all over the place. Now, there's tricky comparison birds. And so I want to take a look at my timing here. I'm doing pretty good. And I think I was kind of gifted, fortunately, a few extra minutes, which is really good for me. Try not to work into those too much. Getting to know these challenging pairs or mini groups of birds, greater and lesser yellowlegs, long and short-billed dowitchers, least and semi-palmated sandpipers, and then kind of like the pectoral Bairds and white rup sandpipers as like a little mini group as well. Getting to know these differences on these birds is most of the game, in my opinion. Like if you can start to break these down, there's 2, 4, 6, 9 birds right here. If you can break these down, then with all of the easy birds that are like, okay, that has a pretty consistent pattern. If you can get to these, the shorebird group is done as far as I'm concerned. Like there's going to be some nuance and challenges, and there's going to be fall plumage and things of that sort. But your entry point, the meat of it in the center is this stuff right here. I took a few pictures off of eBird because I don't have pictures nearly this good. So I gave credit where it's in here. These are pictures that are posted up by individuals in their eBird lists, and they can be used for nonprofit purposes. So that's what I'm doing. This is, I believe, Demelza that had this at Albany at WTP. So again, a sewage pond. That was on one of the lists. This is a decurved bill. This is what a decurved bill looks like at ultra close range. You can begin to see this bill arc down just slightly. That's what somebody means when they say it has a decurved bill. Now, sometimes it's going to be a much longer bill, like the Dunlin we've already seen. And then here's the yellow legs. As you can see, these are almost like pasty. And just imagine it walks through mud for 6 hours a day, and it's going to be really hard. But on the right day, on the right light, and the right surface, you can see the yellow legs plain as day. When we look into a semi-palmated sandpiper that's very similar to it, look at the bill and immediately see how dark black it is, how blunted it is, and its lack of a down curve. It doesn't have the down curve. So if you can get to the bill and if you can get that identification, it can really help. I point this out only because it's comical. This was at a sewage pond. I took this picture up in Ironton, Minnesota in Crow Wing County. I was granted access to this sewage pond in 2019, driven around it, and got this picture. And it is literally the only time in 11 years I've ever seen the semi-palmate or partially webbed toes of this species. This is just to point out you don't always get to see everything that's in the book. It is another reminder. Please be sure to make your identifications based on multiple criteria. You can identify this bird versus the other bird in breeding plumage based on the tone, the overall color tone of the scapulars on the wings and the back. These guys are much grayer in appearance, and this isn't a very good picture for it. These guys are a little browner and rustier. And when you see them side by side, you get it, but it takes time and you have to put in that, effort in the field. Checking time here, so just a few more minutes. One of the best metrics I've found for the yellow legs, lesser and greater, is the bill and head comparison. So I just took this picture. This is mine. This is from the same sewage pond up in Ironton. I got my best shorebird pictures ever sitting inside of a car looking at the rocks on a sewage pond. From the bill tip to the base of the bill, and then from the base of the bill to the back of the head is the almost identical distance. That length is the same as this length. And I'm just seeing, I got a text message from Jen saying there's a lot of questions in the chat. Actually, I was hoping this would make it a little bit easier if I can get them. Yeah, I can't get them on my screen very well. So we will pop through. Here's a greater yellow legs. Notice the bill. I'm going to go back quickly. See this bill and see how needle-like it is. It's very pinpoint, and it is not super thick. Over on this bird, it is a thicker bill, and it's not as needle-like, but look at the distance. I measured this distance and then copied this and pasted it here. Its bill is longer than its head by an order of magnitude compared to a lesser yellow legs. That is a helpful metric if you can see that in the field and say, okay, that bill is definitely way too long. It's a greater. When you see them side by side, it becomes more obvious. You've got really thick, stocky legs on the greater and thinner ones over here. The barring is different. The overall size is just, this is a hulking mass compared to a lesser. When they're independent, it's very difficult to tell. That's why you need to use many characteristics. I think I'm going to do one more bird right here, and then I'm going to stop and try and answer some of the questions with the few minutes we do have remaining. The Baird sandpiper is as close as you can get to a generic bird. It has dark legs. It has just kind of an average bill. Doesn't have a whole lot going for it, but one thing that it does have is there is no streaking on the underside flanks. This happens to be a white rump sandpiper. You can see these little streaks along the flanks right here. That's something that shows up in white rump sandpiper and only western sandpiper, really, on these types of birds with a full white underbelly, a little bit of flank streaking. You're pretty much in white rump sandpiper territory. Here, you got to be thinking Baird sandpiper and then eliminating the other, maybe smaller ones. But this one here is a lock. The tail is this lower section right here that I've got the arrow on, and the wings are here. When the wings extend past the tail, you're in Baird's territory or white rump territory. They have longer wings because they migrate longer distances and they're smaller birds. So they need, greater flight capability. They have this very tapered, kind of long, kind of pulled out back half of their body to them. That's the kind of stuff that I'm talking about that you need to pay attention to. And field guides point this stuff out all the time. All About Birds does. Literally, this is a study group. It's part of the reality of shorebirds. I've got a bunch here on short and long-billed dowitchers. This is an exercise for, I'm actually going to pause on this a second, just so that the recording, when it goes up on YouTube, somebody could pause this and see these and see the things. I do not make my short-billed and long-billed dowitcher identifications on anything less than like 10 or 15 minutes of observation, because I'm never confident that I'm right. And I always want a friend with me to help, because I feel like I'm always getting it wrong, or I'm just on the edge of thinking I know what I'm talking about when I don't on it. So something to pay attention to. All right. That is that stuff. I am aware there have been questions in the chat. How do you guys want to handle that? Do we have time?
Ben, I think some of the questions you'll be able to answer just well, in the chat itself.
Okay. Yep.
A few of the huge questions are people love your slides. I think they'd love to hear more from you as well.
Yeah.
So if we can make your slides accessible for folks to print almost like a little booklet, and then maybe we might want to consider having a more in-depth session separately, because this is just been fantastic. Your photos are great. There were a few questions that I think would help everybody really understand some of the things you talked about. There were a few questions wondering about drawdowns and which Facebook page do you refer to when finding drawdowns and about drawdowns.
Yeah, Minnesota Birding Facebook group is a very good one. And if you're a little bit more hardcore, Minnesota County Listers. So Minnesota Birding is a lot more generalized around the state and stuff. It has a lot of members. And sometimes things can get lost out there. But Minnesota County listers as a group, even if you're just a fly on the wall in that group, that's the one you're going to find it, because the hardcore listers and individuals want to know when there's a really good shorebird spot in a county that they need more birds in. Those are the two locations I would pay the most attention to find that kind of extra info that pops up, because some DNR person said, hey, I know about a drawdown at a WMA on the western edge of the state, just letting y'all know. That's how that info comes in.
And then some are really cool questions. And I think if we do a longer Ben Shorebird presentation and tape it, that we can cover those. But one was the relationship of shorebirds to waterfowl. And then also, can you even find shorebirds in northern Minnesota? If you can do a quick answer for that one. And I think most of the rest are things like, how much of MOU data comes from eBird? What spotting scope do you recommend? Some of those great questions that I think you can answer in the chat.
Yeah. So referring to waterfowl and shorebirds, the dabblers, so specifically like green and blue-winged teal and northern shoveler, you should find them synonymous with one another. If you know a good northern shoveler spot or a good teal spot, that's a good spot to look for shorebirds. Divers, not so much. So at Lake Billsby, for example, most of the really good waterfowl, the divers specifically end up being more in the eastern part of the lake, and the western part of the lake segments out these dabblers and the shorebirds. So when you find dabblers, that's where you should be finding shorebirds at the same time. So dabblers and shorebirds kind of synonymous with one another. There's some exceptions to this. The phalarope have the tendency to use a little more open water. They can stir the pot. They'll be like right out in the middle of a sewage pond, pond that might be relatively deep. So there is a little bit of nuance to it. The one thing I do want to note, some of these birds like drier substrate. Specifically buff-breasted sandpiper and upland sandpiper. You go to a sewage pond and there's a farm field across the street, turn around and look at the farm field for a while too, because that's where you're going to find some of those birds as well. So if you're just looking at general birds in the sewage ponds, turn around and look at the fields and listen as well, because upland sandpipers will make noise from those spaces. And yes, northern Minnesota, plenty of opportunities up there. It just trails off. The more west you go, the more agriculture flat grasslandy you get. The boreal forest is very difficult for a lot of these shorebirds. That's why Duluth is insane for them, because they have a giant beach up there. But it can be very challenging to get really good stuff, say in Cass County or Koochiching or whatever, unless you get to a river or a lake edge or shoreline or whatever.